As a culture, as a society, as individuals, we have a natural fear of what's new, of what's next technologically. And certainly one of the newest technologies that has generated fear on both sides of the ideological political divide is artificial intelligence. What is AI? What are its implications, both for solving problems that have confounded generations of us, but also its implications for harm? We're sitting down today with an expert on this field, somebody who has fought this battle in multiple states and at the highest levels of the federal government, Carl Szabo. Carl Szabo, you are the Vice President, the General Counsel for NetChoice. You're also a professor of Internet Law at George Mason, the Scalia School, so I'm assuming you're an originalist.
Yep.
Am I correct in that?
Oh, absolutely. It makes life so easy because if somebody asks you a question, you look at the Constitution. If it's in there, you do it. If it's not, you can't. Pretty simple.
Absolutely. That's the way it should be. The good old days, man. Also, according to the Washingtonian, a tech titan. Now, I'm telling you, that is something that will never be on my resume. So mad props to you on that designation as well. Just an incredibly impressive resume. And so we're very grateful you were willing to come on, Carl. And so much to talk about. I really want to get into AI, but we want to save the best for last, so to speak. I wanted to start out. You guys, the mission of your organization, as I understand it, making the internet safe for free expression and for free enterprise. And you guys are currently a couple cases heading up to the U.S. Supreme Court, one out of Florida, one out of Texas. I know you guys are very focused on these cases. Walk us through the basics of these two legal fights you guys are engaged in.
Yeah, absolutely. And thanks for having me on. I'm really excited to be here. Long-time listener, first-time speaker. So at NetChoice, I wake up every single day. We've been doing it for almost 25 years, fighting for free expression, free enterprise on the internet. A good example of what that did for all of us, one of those things we don't appreciate too much, is once upon a time when you had your optometrist take your eye measurements and give you a prescription, you couldn't actually get your prescription and take it somewhere else and get your contacts made or your glasses made. You can only get it made in one spot, the optometrist. So one of the early missions of NetChoice was to break down that barrier, that intrinsic monopoly that optometrists had over our glasses. And that has carried forward to everything we do. And we are, fortunately, kind of true believers here at NetChoice of free expression and free enterprise on the internet. And what that means, and you kind of alluded to the two cases where we are the lead plaintiff before the U.S. Supreme Court. We have oral arguments coming up at the end of February, and they are centered on exactly that, protecting free speech on the internet. Now, look, I am a Republican, I'm conservative, and I do get very frustrated at the stuff on social media when I see it is limiting or impeding conservative speech. It upsets me, it angers me. I think it upsets and angers us all. But the originalist and the conservative side of my brain then chimes in and says, whoa, Carl, that is their right as a private business to decide what content they want to host, what speech they want to host. If they want to host conservative speech, they can host conservative speech. If they want to host cat videos and not dog videos, they can host cat videos. And it's the same underlying premise that we see in a lot of the decisions coming out of the U.S. Supreme Court that conservatives like. A good example would be Hobby Lobby, Masterpiece Cakes, and 303 Creative. All of them are centered on the fundamental premise that private businesses can decide what's best for their users and their customers. Okay, so we believe that whether it's offline or online, and even when it hurts conservatives or helps conservatives, because they're right. The easy way that I oftentimes describe this is I love Chick-fil-A sandwiches. I think we all do. And every Sunday comes around and you are hankering for a Chick-fil-A sandwich. As much as I want a Chick-fil-A sandwich on Sundays, I do not want the government forcing them to be open. That is their right as a private business to decide, hey, for religious purposes, I don't even want to be open on Sundays. Okay, cool. Okay, so get into the cases. Two cases, both based on Florida law, First Amendment law, Florida and Texas. And essentially what they did is they said social media platforms may not remove political content, period. Okay, so initially you're thinking, that sounds like a good idea. We'll have this kind of open forum. And then you start to pause and think about it for a minute. So not even getting into the First Amendment problems, but getting into the policy problems. There's a lot of terrorist recruitment out there. There's a lot of people who support animal abuse. There are a lot of people who support child predation. Those are arguably political issues. I can make it, I'm an attorney. I can make an argument for anything. So what that would mean is these social media platforms could not remove that content. Now, typically when we say political content, you only think, Democrat, Republican, but there's a lot of crazy crap out there that we probably don't want in front of us. So these two laws, one in Florida, one in Texas, would deny the rights of social media platforms to remove that content and actually force them to host it. In Florida, actually, the law is written so broadly that Etsy, the place where you go buy boutique products, would be required to host political content, which is completely at odds with their business model. Okay, so that choice came in. We brought a lawsuit under the First Amendment. We won essentially all the way up to the U.S. Supreme Court. Texas is slightly different, but ultimately we are now before the U.S. Supreme Court, and it is all about the First Amendment, the right of a private business to remove content that it doesn't want and to not have to engage in government-compelled speech, which ultimately this is about. It'd be the same as somebody coming on, the government coming in and saying you have to host a politician that you just don't want to host, or maybe you don't think is particularly interesting. You would balk at that.
That would be most of them.
Yeah, exactly. The Miami Herald had to face a similar law before the U.S. Supreme Court about a decade ago, and the U.S. Supreme Court said no, states cannot force private businesses to say something they don't want to say. So those are the two cases we have there. And once again, as a conservative, do I want more conservative speech? 100%. But as a conservative, I want the right of that private business to decide what's best for their users and their customers. Now, just real quickly, and then we'll jump in. Not to think your listeners think I only go after Republican states. We have a very famous lawsuit that is currently ongoing against the state of California. And they are actually forcing websites to remove speech that the state of California thinks should be removed. So we said, I don't care if you're red, blue, purple, or any other color of the rainbow. You violate the First Amendment, you impede free expression, free enterprise on the internet, we will raise the red flag, and we will use litigation as a last resort if lawmakers decide to go down this failed rabbit hole of unconstitutional actions.
I love it. And I'm also, as you talk about the cat videos and Chick-fil-A, I'm trying to picture Oliver Wendell Holmes with those concepts in his mind, formulating that marketplace of ideas doctrine. But I think you expressed it very well. We exist as a society, ideally, to foster speech that we don't necessarily agree with. However, as you point out, there's a commercial line. You're exactly right. We get to decide who we interview. You get to decide what shows you go on. And so certainly I'm with you on the Chick-fil-A hankering, by the way. But let me ask you this, pivoting to sort of the federal structure right now. We're going to get into this a lot more when we talk about AI. But I did want to ask you, one of the candidates currently running for the Republican presidential nomination, the former governor of our home state here in South Carolina, Nikki Haley, proposed back in November a sort of social media registry in response to some of the, and again, let's call it what it is, the anti-Semitic rhetoric that was emanating in the aftermath of the latest Middle Eastern crisis, just horrific stuff. I think we can all agree on that. But Haley, in response to that, and I quote, said, "Every person on earth should be verified by their name." She then went on a podcast afterward and said, quote, "I want the names." Now, for those of us, again, conservatives by nature who don't want government getting into free expression, found some of that language alarming. What was your take on Nikki Haley's social media comments last fall?
Look, I'm Jewish, so I kind of understand the frustration. But I simultaneously respect the right of people who completely disagree, who I completely disagree with, who I think are zany, to have their right to speak as well. I think the important thing with the First Amendment, as we kind of go back to where we were, it does not matter what you say. And that's the core core fundamental thing that separates the United States from the rest of the world. If you say something out of line in Europe, you can be arrested. Just to be clear, in France today, if you were to wear a crucifix around your neck to school, you would be required to take it off. They do not allow any religious paraphernalia in schools. So if you're an atheist, that's great for you. But if you're actually somebody of faith, you can't do anything. That's terrifying. That should scare the pants off of all of us. Coincidentally, just the other day, I was in Annapolis, Maryland. They are trying to enact a law that would require ID for the internet, where if you make a post that that is decided to be, quote, disinformation, you would be branded on a public website of engaging in election denial. People from the Board of Elections would show up at your door and try to correct you. And that should terrify us all. The right of anonymous speech is a right. Free speech is predicated by anonymous speech. And there are a lot of businesses out there, a lot of NetChoice members that are actually centered around anonymous speech. X is a good example of that. X engages in anonymous speech. You don't have to give over any personal information to create an account. Reddit, not a NetChoice member, but also allows anonymous speech. Some members decide to go in a different direction. Facebook is a real name system. But it is the right of individuals to speak freely without fearing government repercussions. And we all know how this would end up. I appreciate what the former governor and former UN secretary was saying with, yeah, we should have ID for the internet. It sounds good in a campaign slogan, but when you start to think about how really scary that is, especially with the amount of conversations, discussions that we have on the internet today with some expectation of anonymity, that's terrifying, and it's something we should all oppose. Now, ironically, the law that we're fighting in California, for example, there are similar ones that we have that we're the lead plaintiff in Ohio and Arkansas and Utah, would actually require ID for the internet to actually enforce them. And they would require verification of every single individual every time you go to a website or try to do a Google search. And I can promise you, if you think back through your search history of the past 2 weeks, there's almost at least one search you did that somebody could use to make you look bad. And that's exactly what we're looking at if we want
Just
ID
one?
for the internet.
Just one. I'd be lucky if that were true, but you're exactly right. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Oh, no, like there was a skit once upon a time about people getting hacked for our data. I was talking about the Target data breach back in the day. It's like, if you want people to turn traitor, just get their Google search history. Because, man, there's a lot in there. But that's essentially what we're talking about with ID for the internet. And it's really scary. And it was an interesting idea. It was a trial balloon, clearly. And since then, I think pretty much Nikki Haley has run in the exact opposite direction of that and said, oh, yeah, I was just trying it out. It didn't work. Bad idea. Moving on. And I appreciate that she's made that pivot. But absolutely, ID for the internet is one of the scariest things for free speech, free expression, individual liberties, and all those things our founding fathers created when they created the Bill of Rights.
Indeed. And of course, the Federalist Papers, anonymous speech there. Clearly, the Biden administration, though, and we've seen this with the revelations in the aftermath of COVID, just the undue influence that was exerted on those social media companies, and they complied to the letter. It was frighteningly, 1984-ish. I want to ask you about this, though. We've been talking about the liberty component, but you guys are also big on the commercial side of the equation. I wanted to ask you this. I was on your Twitter page the other day looking at some stats that really shocked me because I'm very focused on small business, on startups. I'm not a big fan of crony capitalism. And so my focus here in South Carolina anyway is to try to build businesses, build employment, build income from the ground up. And you had a stat on there referring to Bidenomics and its impact on venture capital. And one of the reports you linked to, we pulled it up, 52% decline in the real value of VC deals. And then the deal count also dropping dramatically over the past just 2 years. As you guys look at this regulatory climate that we're in right now, What is the impact that it's having on that key innovative engine, and how do we reverse it?
Yeah, one of the biggest problems for small businesses is regulation. Anything that increases your cost to operate makes it harder for you to operate. There's a statistic, I think it was Steve Moore who unearthed this over at Committee to Unleash Prosperity. He found that the average number of years of real world business experience in the Biden administration is less than 2. Across all government appointees, less than 2 years of real world business experience. The current chair of the Federal Trade Commission, this is the agency that essentially oversees every single business. I don't care if you're a newspaper stand or you are Amazon. They oversee you all. She has
Did
never
you work
worked a
there?
day.
You worked there briefly, didn't you?
Yeah, once upon a time. But the current chair, the person who runs the agency, has never worked a day in the real world, never worked in a private business. She basically went straight from law school to an NGO to some time on the Hill to the Federal Trade Commission. That's terrifying because she does not understand the fundamentals of actually signing the front of a paycheck. There are a lot of people in the Biden administration who know how to sign the back of a paycheck, but have never signed the front of a paycheck. So they don't understand what it's like to have accounting fees, management fees, some regulator show up at your door and try to shut you down by finding some error. And what we've seen time and time again is at agencies like the Federal Trade Commission is they are actively blocking mergers and acquisitions. Now, that sounds not like a big deal for small businesses, but it's a huge deal for small businesses. So a merger or acquisition basically is an off-ramp opportunity for businesses that have either reached their maximum potential in growth, or the owner's like, you know what, I want to go do something else, and they sell their business. If you're a venture capitalist,
some days.
Exactly. And if you're a venture capitalist, you have one goal. You want to invest in something that will make you money. And one of those best ways to make money is either you drive a business to become incredibly successful and just turns ridiculous profits, or it is acquired. And essentially what has happened under the Biden administration over at what's called the Federal Trade Commission is they are blocking acquisition after acquisition. I don't care if it's big or small, if it's legal or illegal, they're blocking them all. They're burying them in red tape. And as an investor, you would not invest in something that is not as likely to give you money. A simple example recently, the Federal Trade Commission and the European Union, and what we're seeing from the Biden administration is this collusion between the two. So what the US laws will not allow the Federal Trade Commission, Biden's Federal Trade Commission to do, they're actually coordinating and colluding with the European antitrust enforcers to do what the Biden administration can't do. Amazon was out there wanted to acquire the robot vacuum company iRobot. Today, there are about a dozen different robot vacuum companies. iRobot was one of them. Block, regulatory red tape. It eventually became so expensive to complete the acquisition that it was abandoned just a couple weeks ago. The end result, 32% of iRobot employees were laid off. 32% of Americans lost their job because this otherwise seamless acquisition was riddled in regulatory red tape. What does that send a message to every single investor? Don't invest in small businesses because you are not guaranteed, you are not likely to ever see a return on your investment.
What was the basis, just out of curiosity, what was the basis that the government offered for its objections?
So the underlying argument is, well, this will eliminate competition in the robot vacuum cleaner market. I'm sorry, you can simply do a search literally on Amazon today and see at least half a dozen to a dozen different companies. In fact, the New York Times recommends the best value and the best robot vacuum cleaner, neither of which are iRobot. They're a direct competitor. So this is part of the thing that the Federal Trade Commission would never be able to win that case in court because there's no evidence of market power. There's no evidence of consumer harm. In fact, it would be good for consumers. So instead, what they can't win in court, they will just bury in regulatory burdens. And that's exactly the point that you raise. Anytime you raise the cost to operate, you make it harder to get investment capital. You make it harder to get your business off the ground. You make it harder to keep it running. One last point I think is worth noting. is because we're going to talk about AI in a moment. You're seeing some of the mega companies. Microsoft is a good exemplar of this. Microsoft is the largest corporation on the planet. And just the other day, Bill Gates is out there calling for a global AI governance, supporting legislation that would deny innovation and development without government permission. And the reason that Microsoft is doing this in part is because they know they're the largest corporation on the planet. They have the lawyers, they have the regulatory bodies, they have the lobbyists, and they can pull up the drawbridge on any other company trying to build or develop artificial intelligence and prevent them from even getting off the ground because the startup doesn't have the lawyers. They're spending all their money and resources in innovation. And so that's what we're really seeing is regulatory red tape benefits big incumbents and it harms those startups, those investors, those guys just trying to make their dream come true.
So it's a collusive, this is a Microsoft and the government partnering to essentially shut down any competition. Is that what's happening?
I mean, I can't say that they are directly colluding per se, but it would not surprise me if that's part of the method behind it. Look, it's what I would do if I were them, right? It's easier to not have to compete with anybody, to spend a couple $1 million on lawyers and lobbyists, if it means that I never have to worry about somebody coming up behind me and taking over my dominant position. And so that's where NetChoice comes in, because we, periodically have members who do support legislation. We do have members that oppose it. What NetChoice, what I get up every single day trying to do is plow the field of regulatory burdens, regulatory regulations, and make it easier for businesses to compete. Because when businesses compete, Americans win. And the greatest thing, the secret sauce of America, is that we allow people to dream, build, and create without the government coming in and giving a papal sanction or a king coming in and saying, you may do it. In America, you want to do it, go do it. And that's one of the things that NetChoice supports, and actually putting our money where our mouth is. We are out there working with lawmakers to break down regulatory burdens. And if push comes to shove, we use litigation as a last resort.
Well, unfortunately, the American regulatory state is becoming far more onerous than any monarch or former pope, I would argue. We're in a dangerous point. We're going to talk about this a little bit now as we dive into AI. And I got to tell you, this is something I'm incredibly excited to talk to you about, because you're an expert and I am literally a blank slate. So as long as you promise that no pod bay doors are going to be closed or open during this segment, we should be all right. But I wanted to start off with the very simple discussion of defining this new technology. Obviously, it's been around longer than most people realize, but interview earlier this week, you were on a show being interviewed by a gentleman by the name of Carl Jackson, I believe. Great interview. But you described it as machine learning. I went on, I think, Cato Institute, one of my favorite sites as a big libertarian. They had a book out by a couple of their experts working with some folks at Brookings, and they had cited a definition by a couple of Indian engineers, and I wanted to read this to you because it made sense to me. You know, I'm a words guy, so this sort of resonated with me. But described AI as, I quote, machines that respond to stimulation consistent with traditional responses from humans, given the human capacity for contemplation, judgment, and intention. So let me ask you this: how is that not Hal, and why, and how should I not be a little bit worried about that? And then we're going to talk about the AI applications and the tools for using it for good, for evil, the whole debate. But let's get into first, what is it to you, Carl?
So for me, it's a tool at the end of the day. It's the thing that will drive us, to drive innovation for the next decade, next 100 years. It is actually a true game changer for the way we live. And it's actually not new, as you kind of allude to. So what is AI? I'll explain in a couple minutes why the definition in the Biden executive order is a terrible definition of artificial intelligence. But AI is essentially, I describe it as machine learning. And the way to think about it is, and there are a couple different levels of it. The way to think about it is if you are typing into your phone, you know, I had lunch today, and we all make typos. I have the fattest thumbs possible. And you go back and you fix it. And the next time you type it, the phone gets it right. That's because the phone has learned from the actions that we took. It has improved its predictive algorithms. It has said, when Carl types this, he actually means this. And so that's machine learning. We've seen machine learning in spam detection and prevention of emails. So if every time it was just, this is a spam email gets blocked, well, the spammers will change it a little bit and be able to slip through. So the system is constantly learning and adapting and updating to be able to block the bad actors. And then, of course, search is a great example of machine learning, right? It's constantly getting better at predicting what we want based on what people like us are searching for at that time. With Super Bowls coming up, if everyone's starting to type out what time is Kansas and it auto completes, the game starts at 7 p.m. It's because a lot of people, and it's learning that. That's machine learning. So what's the big game change? Well, the game change happened and became kind of public about a year and a half ago. ChatGPT has really only been around publicly for about 14 months. It's incredible to think. It's been that little, it's not even 2, and it's changed so much. Well, what did ChatGPT do? It used generative and transformative. So that's the G and the T in ChatGPT. And what it was doing is it's able to take a bunch of little sentences and begin predicting what the next word is. And so a good example would be, the sky is blue. When it does that, it also injects some uncertainty in its responses, because if every time it turned out the sky is blue, it would get pretty boring. If everything was the same, it would get boring. So sometimes it says the sky is green, and that's called a hallucination because we all know the sky is blue and stuff like that. And it's getting better based on the responses. So that's what AI is. So what does that mean for me? What does that mean for your listeners? There are 3 things that I like to point to that we've been unable to crack the code on in human development: curing cancer, clean renewable energy through nuclear fusion, and creating the greatest crop yields to feed the world. We have thrown billions, if not trillions of dollars, the brightest and smartest scientists in human history at these 3 problems and have not been able to do it. AI may be the thing that figures it out, because what it can do is it can test, analyze the results, adjust and retest in fractions of seconds. So cold fusion or cancer detection, it can look at millions of pieces of cancer research, be able to connect the dots in ways that humans just can't. We don't have the bandwidth, we don't have the mental capacity, we get tired, we are up too late, watching the Super Bowl. If you can tell, I'm excited for the Super Bowl. The AI doesn't have that problem, and it can begin finding things that we're missing. Now, it's not going to replace radiologists, for example. Radiologists are the people who look at mammograms and cancer x-rays and similar. But it will help them do their jobs better. Teachers, it will not replace teachers. But teachers like myself spend so much time doing lesson planning. And AI can help us generate our lesson plans, but you're still going to need teachers to actually do the teaching. So that's what I see AI as. It is a tool to make my life, to make our lives easier. And potentially, if it can solve cancer, if it can solve nuclear fusion, or it can solve increasing crop yields, that is world-changing discoveries. World-changing discoveries. It could just do one of those. And so that's why I'm so excited about AI.
Let's talk about, we talk about machine learning, but was it not human learning that brought us the printing press, that brought us dwarf wheat, if you want to talk about increasing yields to reduce hunger, put a man on the moon, all these advances, created the internet. Thank you, Al Gore. But we think about all these advances that we've made that were controlled by human understanding. And I guess my question to you is, the potential to surrender that doesn't concern you at all.
Yeah, I mean, it's one of those things, you got to always be able to pull the plug on something. Now, we are ever increasingly handing over control to other people. Whether it is I hail a taxi or get in an Uber, I am actively handing over control to somebody else. I'm saying, you can drive me. I'm going to trust that you will deliver me safely. The same thing's true with AI. We're already seeing it integrated today in our cars. My Honda has lane keep assist. It will do auto braking. It will auto match the car in front of me. So, as President Reagan used to say, trust but verify. And as it shows that it is doing what it needs to do, then we can hand it more responsibility. But we always need to be able to retain the power to pull the plug on it. And for those worried about, you mentioned HAL. I also like to mention the movie War Games with the Whopper. Like, let's not connect it to the nuclear arms. How about that? Okay, that's a good idea. We can create built-in redundancies, but the answer is not what we are seeing from some to pause or stop innovation, pause or stop development, pause or stop research. And one of the main reasons for that is if the entire Western world decides to stop developing artificial intelligence, I can guarantee you the rest of the world will not stop and is not stopping and is developing this technology. One of the reasons why the United States has been the leader in technological evolution is because we empower people with the freedom to build, develop, and create. And if we give away our technological independence like we did our energy independence, well, then only foreign nations and foreign developers and those bad actors who didn't pause or stop or follow the law will be dependent on them. And that should really scare us all at the same time. The other thing, and just real quickly, that gives me confidence is the way that the US legal system has operated and has always operated is that we do not outlaw tools. We outlaw bad actions. This is one of the fundamental differences from us, from the rest of the world. Simple example is a hammer. Hammer can be used to build a house or break a window. We don't outlaw hammers. We outlaw destruction of private property, regardless of whether it is done with a hammer, a baseball bat, a fist, or a baseball. Destruction of private property, I don't care how you do it, is destruction of private property. So under that analysis, AI today is heavily regulated. So any lawmaker, any politician comes out and says there's no laws governing AI, either doesn't know or is intentionally deceiving. And the former is what we're trying to fix. So what we need from government is not more laws. We don't need more regulation. If you're worried about harassment, deception, fraud, misinformation, impersonation, whatever, we have laws today to address all those problems. We don't need more laws. We need more law enforcement. That's where the government continues to fail. We are not seeing law enforcement. And the simple example is Sam Bankman-Fried, the guy from FTX, went to prison, not because he traded in crypto, but he engaged in fraud. So as soon as lawmakers actually start enforcing against bad actors doing bad things with AI, the message will be crystal clear to every bad actor out there that I don't care how you do it or the tools you use, you break the law, you're going to prison.
So I got to ask you this, though, Carl. When we talk about curing cancer, feeding the world, sustainable energy, and applying AI to those solutions, which I think we would all agree massively positive for humanity. But then we've got these other applications. We've got a law being advanced here in South Carolina. I'll probably send it to you after the show, let you look at it. But talking about how child predators use it to create these disturbing images, how do we deal with those? So as we look at the applications here, how do we draw that line, number one, between the enforcement against improper applications, yet also maintaining, again, that, as you mentioned, basic intellectual control over the technology?
Yeah, it's a great question. It's one of the pieces of legislation that NetChoice is actually working with a number of state lawmakers on. So one of the things we did is we went back and, as identified, AI is heavily regulated today. All the laws that apply offline, apply online, and apply to AI. And we looked to see if there were any gaps that need to be filled. And one of those gaps is the exact thing that you brought up, child sexual abuse material, or CSAM as it is called. The laws as they are written today in most every jurisdiction is that it has to be a real photograph of a real minor. By minor, I mean somebody under the age of 18. A real photo of a real minor. The problem is, as you identify, is child abusers are essentially using AI to use the letter of the law to escape the purpose of the law. So NetChoice has actually drafted some model legislation that we're working with lawmakers on enacting to close that gap, to make it clear that if you have an actual minor and you're using AI to put them in sexual positions, no, that's still child sexual abuse material. We're going to enforce against you. And this gets back to the underlying issue of what is the problem we are trying to solve? Well, the problem we're trying to solve is child sexual abuse material. How do we solve that? Well, we need to update the law to apply to AI, not let's ban the use of AI. So that's exactly the approach that we support. We have similar legislation that enables private rights of action when somebody uses an image of somebody and generates AI to put them in a compromised sexual position. And that's another gap fill that needs to be done. But once again, we're not creating fundamentally new laws. We're updating existing laws to apply to AI, and we're not banning the technology. And so that's the important way to address it is, what is the problem we're trying to solve? Are there existing laws to address it? If not, do we need to fill in gaps? And that's how we keep everything moving forward. It's something I've written about on a couple of different places, and something NetChoice actively works with lawmakers to do. We need to fill in those gaps. We need to protect our children. And we need to make sure that bad actors doing bad things are held accountable for what they do.
And speaking of bad actors doing bad things, let's talk about the Biden response. And you have referred to it as the administration attempting to seize control of AI. And I think one of the things that you referred to in referencing that executive order, that it was a regulatory threat from the president, one of several regulatory threats, obviously emanating from the federal government. But correct me if I'm wrong, did this policy not originate from Biden watching a Mission Impossible movie? Is that really true?
It is. I feel like we are living in a mirror universe where this should not be the situation. One of Biden's higher ups came out and said this publicly, it's been reported on, that he and the president, Biden, were sitting and watching the new Mission Impossible movie at Camp David, where the bad guy is AI. He clearly didn't watch the movie because the real bad guy is government, but beside the point. So Biden watches it and sees AI is the bad guy and says, oh my gosh, we need to do something about AI. Now, I do not want our national policy being written by Tom Cruise. I love him as an actor, but not as a policy director. I'm terrified to think of what will happen when Joe Biden sees the movie Godzilla. Maybe we start building walls back for a change, but it's to stop Godzilla this time.
Maybe we should make him watch Godzilla.
Yeah, exactly. But yeah, it's really terrifying that that's part of the policy. Now, a number of people in the Democratic administration, the Biden administration, are legitimately worried about AI. But it's not because they're worried about it being used against American people in bad ways, like we just talked about, child sexual abuse and stuff like that. They are more concerned about it being used against President Biden in the 2024 election. Many in the Democratic Party, so many in the Democratic Party continue to believe that Hillary Clinton lost in 2016, not because she was a bad candidate, not because Donald Trump was a good candidate, but because of social media. And they are terrified that artificial intelligence will be used in some way to elevate President Trump over Joe Biden in 2024. And a good example of that would be, there was actually a fake phone call that sounded like President Biden in New Hampshire.
Yeah, that's right.
Saying, I am actually taking myself off the ballot. Well, first of all, okay. But actually, it was a NetChoice member pin drop that was able to look at the artificially generated fake statement from Joe Biden, identify who created it, and just the other day, they started kicking in doors and arresting those bad actors. That's how we do that. Now, remember, AI may be new, but all you need is somebody to impersonate Joe Biden to have the same outcome. You don't need AI to accomplish that outcome. There are a lot of people who can sound like Joe Biden. I mean, Saturday Night Live has somebody who does impersonations all the time. So there is this fear of AI, but that's being used as the excuse to seize control of AI. There are a lot of bills that are being enacted and pushed around the country that require any politician using so-called artificial intelligence in their ad to disclose it. Now, that's great for incumbents because you're now making it harder for your competitor to increase their name recognition. And it sounds like a good idea. If I use AI in my ad, then that should be disclosed. But the way these laws are written, if a politician is standing in front of a green screen, that's an artificially generated image, you would have to have a disclosure saying part of this campaign video was used generating AI. You've essentially undermined the trust and veracity of the entire campaign video because you used green screen. It's not the way the law is intended, but that's the way the law is written. This gets back to, we have laws today against deception, misrepresentation, and unfair deceptive trade practices. It does not matter if you're using artificial intelligence to create a fake name, fake voice for Joe Biden, or you're using somebody who's just an imposter. It is illegal today. We don't need new laws. We need more law enforcement. And that is kind of my running theme. Now, the Biden executive order, to which you alluded, he sees Mission Impossible. He writes this executive order. It is the longest executive order in American history.
I'm betting he didn't write it. I'm just going to go out on a limb and say I bet he didn't write it, but
probably not. Yeah. Oh no, he just signed the paper that was in front of him. But it is the longest executive order in American history. And the power that was based, once again, this goes back to, I'm an originalist. I believe, the legislative branch writes the laws, the executive branch executes the laws, and the judicial branch interprets the laws. The authority that President Biden claims to have had to create the longest executive order in American history on artificial intelligence comes from the War Production Act. It was created during the Korean War. It was essentially so we could get more tanks built quickly. President Trump actually used this power during COVID. That's a national emergency to make sure we get ventilators and COVID vaccines out more quickly and more easily to people. President Biden says, well, AI is a national security threat. Therefore, I'm going to use this to create and enact the longest executive order in American history. Just the other day, 20 state attorneys generals began sending letters to the administration questioning this. I will expect litigation to question this because this is the type of executive overreach that we have seen time and time again, whether it is with the antitrust that we talked about earlier or now in AI. So what is his executive order? Well, we need to make sure it's not used to permeate disinformation or misinformation. We need to make sure that it's not weaponized in political campaigns and stuff like that. But we saw just 4 years ago what was called disinformation and misinformation in a political campaign, the Hunter Biden laptop story. It turns out to be true. We saw what was called disinformation or misinformation, saying maybe 6 feet standing apart isn't that helpful. Fauci just admitted that the other day. So that's what really scares me. And this gets back to compelled speech and control of speech, because that's ultimately what this is all about. If you control AI, you can control speech. And if AI is the engine for large businesses or all businesses for the next decade, if the government controls it and the government asks you to remove some content unrelated to AI, you are much, much more willing to do it because you don't want to risk biting the hand that feeds you or controls you.
Well, I was about to ask, doesn't that go back to what you were saying earlier about that potential government collusion with these large established companies? Could that be part of that motivation behind Biden's executive order?
I mean, absolutely. I mean, if you look at a number of NetChoice members were essentially pressured to go and sign off on this document because once one of them does it, you don't want to be the one left out of the room. And it's really scary. A lot of these businesses don't want to have to do or remove what the government says. But if you're like any citizen out there, you get a letter from the government. It's got, whether it's the IRS letterhead, whether it is White House letterhead, you're going to pay attention to it. We have a natural inclination to do what the authority, especially somebody that powerful, asks us to do. And that's where the problem is. So that's why I'm really excited to see things like Chairman Jim Jordan over in the House got passed through the House, of course, sits in the US Senate, something called Protecting Free Speech from Government Interference Act, which makes it illegal for government employees to use their governmental positions to pressure social media platforms to engage in political action. And the nice thing about this bill is, look, I'm a former Fed, my family's Feds, federal employees as well. Don't hold that against me. But sometimes employees don't care about the agency. They just care about doing the action. Well, Chairman Jordan's bill holds those federal employees strictly responsible financially. It goes after their paychecks and their pensions if they violate the law. And I can tell you, government employees care about one thing above all, and that is definitely their paychecks and their pensions. I'm not saying that's bad. That's the free market. But that's one of the ways that we stop
so few of them, and especially you pointed out so few of them in this information have any experience signing anything other than the back. It certainly would hit them where it hurts. Carl, you've been incredibly generous with your time, but I do want to ask you one more question before you go. One of the things that you've said about AI, about how education is the key, and that we have this natural fear of new things being manipulated, used adversarially against liberty. I wanted to ask you about that because you have talked about the need for us as a society to embrace AI from an academic perspective. And I wondered if, as we close this segment out, if you could walk us through some of the best practices there. What should K through 12 schools be doing? What should institutions of higher learning be doing? How do we empower these next generations with the not only knowledge of this new technology, but of the ethics that's going to keep it between the lines and away from some of these harmful effects that we've talked about?
Yeah, look, I'm a parent. I've got 2 kids. They're in school, ideally right now. It would be improper for any school right now to graduate somebody who does not understand basically how to use a computer. Because there's no way you go into the workforce not knowing how to use a computer, not knowing how to access the internet, not knowing how to do a Google search. In law school, where I teach, we teach students how to use LexisNexis and Westlaw for legal research, because that is required when you actually exit into the workforce. So since AI is going to be the engine, the tool for the next decade, for the next century, it will be negligent of schools to not teach it, not educate, not teach students how to use these tools. Once upon a time, at least when I was a kid, we had wood shop, we had metalworking, there was auto shop. So you teach people useful tools, useful skills for when they graduate. AI is the same thing. Now, I'm not saying, kindergartners should have AI. And I'm not saying that necessarily it should be pushed in elementary schools. But much in the same way that people freaked out about calculators in the classrooms annihilating math, we've actually seen the opposite. We still teach basic arithmetic. I can promise you, my kids constantly asking how to do long division. But we have used calculators, graphing calculators, computers, to actually begin teaching very advanced mathematical calculations, computations at younger ages. We're talking algebra in middle school, something that was sometimes not even taught in high school. And that's being done because we are teaching how to use the tools. We're not eliminating the education, use the tools. So what I would expect to see, and what I teach in my own class, is I tell my students, look, you can use AI to help write your legal papers, but if that is all you do, your grade will probably reflect it. It will be missing that je ne sais quoi, that human element, because at the end of the day, it's written by a robot. As I mentioned before, the machines make mistakes, they make errors. And if you turn in a paper with a bunch of errors in it, that's going to reflect in your grades. So students are still going to need to know the content, know the information. It's just going to be another tool to help write. And we've actually seen this play out in the real world. Some lawyers up in New York tried to file a brief generated exclusively by AI. Turned out it had a bunch of fake citations, fake links to content, and they got caught. They should have been disbarred. They were not, but they were raked over the coals for it. And so I will say the nice thing about what we believe in NetChoice, or whether it's our SHIELD campaign or the work that we do with state lawmakers, is we believe that parents should be involved, that schools need to educate, and the fundamental job of a school is to prepare people for the workforce. That is my job as a professor at a law school. That is the job of every single teacher in schools. You want to educate, you want to prepare people to become productive, fulfilling members of society. And part of that is now teaching them what is artificial intelligence, its dangers, its opportunities, and how to use it.
Carl, it's a brave new world. It's obviously not going anywhere. Just want to thank you so much for your time and sharing your wisdom with us. And I hope as these issues make their way through the South Carolina legislative process, through the political debate here in the Palmetto State, I hope you'll come back on and share your views on the specifics of some of those proposals. But just can't thank you enough for sharing your wisdom on this and taking your time to walk us through this huge new technological ethical debate. Carl, thank you.
Thanks for having me.